So I'm going to give you a very, very high-level picture, but there is something important here. And it has to do with what is the root cause of this mental health crisis that we are facing, perhaps more than at any other time in history. Now, people may complain that it is the social media, the TikTok culture, that it is consumerism, that it is the apparently steady decline of the spiritual traditions. I think it's a little bit also the fault, or rather the consequence, of science. Science itself, and I'm a scientist. Science, with its success and its power, has taught us something that people have essentially accepted without thinking too much about it, and certainly scientists by and large have. And as I will mention towards the end, I can call them 4 fundamental displacements that have occurred since the time in the late 16th century when Galileo started the scientific revolution. That was the idea that while we thought we were at the center of the universe, each and every one of us, instead we're just a speck in the periphery of a vast, unforgiving universe. We count for nothing, in essence. And then there was Darwin, and the idea that rather than being the pinnacle of creation, we are just the product of chance and necessity. So no matter what you do in the end, it's your genes, it's your environment, you just are along for the ride. And even worse is the neuroscience revolution, in which I'm immersed myself, which essentially has convinced most of my colleagues that we are essentially biological machines or biological computers, that there is a complicated machine, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, the brain, that runs through the motions, and we are carried along by it as an unwitting passenger. So it's not really our fault, it's not really ours to do, we don't really have free will, we don't really do or can do anything to ameliorate mental illnesses. It's just the machine that does what it does, okay? And now finally there's one more displacement, which is artificial intelligence. You all know now about the explosion of ChatGPT, etc., and robots that may sooner or later, in fact pretty soon it looks like, do all the things we do, give better answers than our best friends, know about us more than our spouse. And all of these things, we will begin to think that not only are we not at the center of creation, but we are also sort of peripheral because cognitively we are not much worth. There are things that are better than we are. So no wonder, this was my very, very long introduction to say why there is, in fact, an additional reason for a mental health crisis. No wonder, if you're a young person in this world, and that's essentially what you're imbibed with, that you feel meaningless, that your life is just going to roll on among billions of other lives in a corner of the universe with machines that are going to be smarter than you are. So no wonder there is a problem of meaninglessness, which I think is the root cause of much mental health. And no wonder we need to do something radical about it. Now, what I want to convince you of very briefly is that a lot of that has to do with what science has done in its attempts since Galileo to remove the subject, you and I, the conscious being who actually does science, scientists are conscious too, from what is being studied in order to be objective and therefore powerful, but remove it such that essentially the soul has literally been lost. In science, there is no soul anymore. The soul is something that, according to the majority in science, is sort of a pre-scientific, primitive notion of spiritual traditions. We know better now, okay? We understand the brain, its mechanism, and so on. So at the heart of it all is consciousness, which is the title of my talk, okay? Consciousness, because it is the key thing to unravel, to know our place in the universe, and therefore also our meaning, and the meaning of our life. So let me first define what that is, very briefly, in a way that we all understand. It's very easy to define it in the negative. It's that thing that goes away when you fall into dreamless sleep, or if you're hit on the head, okay? You lose consciousness. And what happens when you lose consciousness? You lose everything. You don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't touch anything, you don't think anything, you don't remember anything, you don't feel any emotions. Everything is gone. So as far as you are concerned, each and every one of us, there is nothing at all. So imagine that for a moment. Just think we are all unconscious for a moment. We all get hit on the head. And there is nothing at all. Okay? Now, oh yeah, we think the mountains are still there, etc. But with nobody around to look at them, would they really be there in a meaningful sense? This is a teaser, but it's important. For each and every one of us, consciousness is all there is. There's another way, more positive, to define it, which is, just to keep it in mind, to be conscious is to have an experience, any experience. You see me, you hear me, you think something, and so on, you're having an experience. And therefore, it is all we have and all we are. Take away consciousness, there is nothing left. Okay? So it's rather important. It's not just some additional little thing. It's everything. Another way to put it is what it is like to be. So if you're conscious, there is something it is like to be you. If you're unconscious, there is nothing. So I think with this, I can move on to what instead the standard scientific view is. So let's forget the soul, consciousness, etc. Let's study what's actually there. And what's actually there is, of course, the brain. We all know that if I hit you on the head, you lose consciousness. So it has to do with the brain, or at least some parts of it. And the brain is indeed a very complicated machine, no doubt about it. For instance, the cerebral cortex, this part up here, has roughly 16 billion neurons, which is a big number, but really not different from the number of transistors in an iPhone. Okay? What it does have, that's remarkable, is 100 trillion synapses, the connections among these neurons. So that you don't find in an iPhone. But it depends how they are arranged. In fact, I want to point out one thing to remember. It's just one very basic thing. Consciousness very much depends on the cerebral cortex, especially some parts of it, as we will see. But if you look down here, the cerebellum, which is this piece back here, it's smaller, but it's very dense with neurons. It's like a super highly populated region of the brain. It has 70 billion neurons, so 5 times more than the cerebral cortex. Incredibly complicated. They respond to sensory stimuli, have motor actions, and so on. You take it out, so you throw away 4/5 of all the neurons in your brain, and sometimes surgeons must do that. And what happens is nothing. So what happens is you are still there, you still see and hear and think and feel. You have some problems in locomotion. You go around a little bit as if you were drunk. Okay, so there are some problems. But consciousness, which is what matters, is unaffected. Okay? So it's not just a matter of being a biological machine. Okay? There is something special. And of course, you can study the brain at many levels of resolution, from regions of the brain to mini columns, to neurons, the cells, to their connections, to the vesicles inside, and so on and so forth. So to the point that, since science studies the machine, a long time ago, more than 300 years ago, a great German philosopher, Leibniz, pointed out right away what the problem was. It became known as the hard problem. And in fact, consciousness is usually considered the hardest problem of them all, together maybe with the origin of the universe. But Leibniz said, and he used the most complicated things he knew about, which was a mill. He said, well, a mill is a machine. You walk into it, you enlarge it, and what you find are gears, you find ropes, you find wheels, you find all kinds of stuff, but ultimately it's a machine. Nowhere will you find any consciousness, any perceptions, he called it. Nobody having a feeling of any sort, seeing the blue of the sky. Nothing of the sort. You just find the machine. And the brain is the same. We constantly work on the brain. This is a section to the brain with all the connections that you can now see with MRI. And this is what we do in the lab, for instance, using electron microscopy. What this is a synapse. So one of these 100 trillion connections. And all these vesicles here contain a chemical, a neurotransmitter that gets released. And then that release is producing an activation here on the other side on another neuron. And that's basically what goes on in these 100 trillion synapses. It's a giant system that's constantly exchanging electrochemical signals. That's all you're going to find. And yet, almost all my colleagues are convinced that we are, after all, either a machine or maybe better, that's what everybody thinks, we are a computer. So there is some software, so to speak, running on the machine that performs certain functions like image recognition and talking and so on, very much like ChatGPT. It can listen and it can talk, and it's pretty smart, okay? So ultimately they think we are some kind of primitive ChatGPT that's implemented on this slow, frail, perishable biological machine. Okay? That's how science sees it. But that is absurd. And by the way, as Leibniz so, it really makes you think that consciousness, the only thing that exists for us, is literally a miracle. Okay? It's like transforming the gray waters of the brain into the phantasmagorical wine of experience. Okay? So it's a miracle. You can't do that. You go in, you find neurons, they fire, they release transmitters, and then there you are with your feelings. Okay? A miracle. And it can't be a miracle. Science needs to take a different tack. And so the main point, and this is really very much my life's work, I decided to work on consciousness when I was 16, and that's why I studied psychiatry and so on, is we don't start from the brain and try to squeeze consciousness out of it. You'll never squeeze consciousness out of the machine. You start from consciousness itself, what it is like to be us, what we experience, and then ask, what does it take to have it? And can we test that? So the approach is then to move from phenomenology, which means consciousness, means experience, to physics. After all, as I said, unlike Galileo, we are doing the physics, we conscious subjects. Okay? And that way, I think, we can make progress. So the progress is embodied by this theory called integrated information theory, or IIT, which I obviously, don't be scared, won't present. You know, I am going to hold a summer school every year in Venice in 10 days from now. It's 8 days of full immersion in this to get down to this. So I cannot do any justice to the theory. I just want to tell you that there is a substantial body of work that really takes the properties of consciousness and says, what do we need? What kind of substrate do we need in order to have it? And why does it feel the way it does? Why does space feel extended, time flowing, object like they bind some general concept like person with some particular features, why red feels like red, and so on. So all of that. And you know, the essence of the theory is expressed in this particular slide that says any experience, like when you wake up in the morning and before there was nothing at all, and then suddenly there is you, your body, your bed, your room, and the mountains outside the window. Okay? When you wake up and suddenly everything comes into being, which is your experience, your consciousness, what does that entail? And the idea is that there has to be a substrate, so something made of things you can, as a physicist, manipulate and observe. There's nothing magical here. That has to have the properties that consciousness has to begin with. And this property, which are here, basically means you need some substrate that's incredibly densely connected, such that no matter how you cut it, you lose a lot. And there's not much in nature that's like that. You know, neurons have 10,000 connections, each of them. They receive them and send them. Transistors have 2 or 3, okay? So there's something very special. And some parts of the brain are very densely connected, satisfying this requirement here. There has to be a complex that's very tightly woven together. And then there is another key aspect, which is you need to look at all the powers of this thing, which is what we call this phi structure or cause-effect structure. Don't worry about the names. The idea is that in the end, any experience should be identical to this thing we can actually work out in principle for simple systems. For our brain, not even remotely yet, but the idea, I think, is there. And the form of this thing, of this structure, captures completely what the experience feels like. And this quantity, phi, which is the sum of this amount of reducibility, how much consciousness there is. So there is a scientific way to find out whether consciousness is present or not, how much, and in which way.